Hi students, in this video I'm going to talk about World War I, the beginnings of World War I, and the beginnings of American involvement in World War I. The history of American involvement in World War I is part of this theme that we're seeing playing out in this part of the course, which is the expansion of American influence, the journey of the United States to become a world power. And this is partly tied to the growth of the United States, but it's also partly tied to changes across the world. That in the past, the Atlantic Ocean had isolated the United States from all the different conflicts that were taking place in Europe. But that this is changing by the time we get to the 20th century. The United States is a bigger and more powerful country. It's more integrated economically with the rest of the world. It's increasingly an imperial power, and so its influence is more spread around the world, and so it's more influenced by what's going on in the world, and it's also influencing events that are taking place across the world. And so this brings us to World War I. In the last video, I talked about how this war begins, how the alliance system leads to all the great European powers declaring war on one another. And that when the fighting begins, it begins with the German assault on France. The German master plan, as you'll see in other videos and other material this week, was to attack and defeat the French quickly, as they had done in the Franco-Prussian War about 50 years earlier, in order to then be able to turn their attention to the Russians, who would be attacking them in the east. And this plan is almost successful, but the German army is halted before it reaches Paris, and then the two sides, the French and the English, against the Germans, dig extensive trench networks, and the borders of this war, the frontier lines of this war, are really not going to shift very much for the next 3 or 4 years. And so this leads to the development of trench warfare. And here we see the problems with industrialization. We see that the technology and the technological advances of the previous 100 years have now moved waging war, the technology for waging war, ahead of military strategy. And so this means that these nations settle down into a long and highly destructive and basically fruitless war, where you have hundreds and thousands of soldiers being wounded and killed, fighting over the same 5 or 10 miles of land in brutal conditions in the trenches, and it really depersonalizing and dehumanizing conditions of trench warfare. And so this becomes a very brutal conflict. And we read American sources that are horrified by what they see when they go to the front, by the bloodshed, by the horror of the first fully industrialized war. And there's a desire on the part of the Americans to stay out of this war, to avoid this war. It's also the case that at this point, even if the United States had wanted to join this war, there would have been real questions about which side of the war they would join. While culturally, the United States remains very closely attached to Great Britain. There's a shared language and a shared literary culture. It's true that at this time, there are 9 million German-born Americans, many German descendants in the United States. There are also 5 million Irish-born Americans who have no time for the British, who don't want to be in an alliance against the British, but there's also a substantial Polish population. And so the real focus of American policymakers at this time is to encourage the unity of the United States, to try and break down some of these ethnic communities in order to fully forge an American identity. And so there's uncertainty over where the United States really sits in this conflict. And so for that reason, aside from just the horror of the war, the United States is going to try and remain neutral, at least for the first part of the war, while reaping the economic benefits from being on the sidelines. Because especially France and Britain require increased supplies of food that they're not able to supply for themselves because there's so much of their population is fighting, increased military supplies. They buy a lot of these supplies from the United States. This leads to a big economic boom in the country. The United States is becoming the #1 manufacturer in the world. The United States is also providing loans to Britain and France and also to Germany, on the understanding they're a neutral power. They loan to both sides. But what we find is that they are loaning far more to Britain and France, to the Allies, than they are to Germany. And what Woodrow Wilson, who at least from the beginning of the war seems to have been committed to the idea of neutrality, what perhaps he didn't realize was that as more and more American loans are invested in the Allies, America is going to find it more and more difficult to remain neutral in this conflict because they have a lot invested in an Allied victory. Nevertheless, it seems as though the United States did try and remain neutral. And in particular, Woodrow Wilson emphasized the neutrality of the seas. And he demanded that both the Central Powers and the Allied powers respect that American ships were neutral and under established conventions of neutral engagement should be able to trade with both the British and the Germans. And both the British and the Germans rejected this appeal. The British continued to seize American ships and to impound them or seize their cargo or force them to sail to England if they were taking goods to Germany. And the Germans likewise tried to respond to the British blockade of their ports, as the British were trying to starve them into submission, by establishing what was called a killing zone. I think that's right, or a killing zone or a dead zone around the British Isles, where any ships that they found there that weren't German, they would sink. And that included American ships, and they were sunk using another new technological development. So World War I, this war in which we see the destructive impacts of new technologies like tanks and machine guns, here's another one, the use of the submarine. And this meant that ships could be sunk without warning, without giving crews a chance to escape. This was seen as another example of the brutality of World War I. And so the relations between the Americans and the Germans are starting to become more hostile. The United States, as I say, from an economic perspective, is more and more tied to an Allied success. And some of Wilson's government recognized that. On the other hand, some politicians, including it seems the president, still seem to want to remain neutral, but they're continually being pushed into war by the Germans. And one example of this is the sinking of ships, most famously the Lusitania, that have American citizens on them or are American ships by German submarines. And the Americans protest about this. It seems as though the Germans try and prevent this, but there continue to be sinkings. And you have things like German agents detonating munitions stockpiles in New York. This is really something it's very difficult for the United States to ignore this, even those who want to remain neutral. When they find that Germany is meddling in their affairs, they find it very difficult to remain neutral. And the straw that really breaks the camel's back, really there are two. The first is the Zimmermann telegram. A very rash communication by the Germans to the Mexican government, trying to encourage them to invade the southern border of the United States in the scenario in which the United States comes into the war on the Allied side. And so the United States hasn't come into the war on the Allied side yet. The Mexican government was going through a revolution. It wouldn't have been able to stage this invasion anyway, in all probability. But this aligns Germany with an attack on the United States. The British get a hold of this telegram. They leak it to the American press and to the American politicians. This means that the Americans will break off diplomatic relations with the United States. The United States will break off diplomatic relations with Germany. And then at the same time, in 1917, the Germans see an opportunity to win the war. The Russian Revolution has happened. The Tsar in Russia has been overthrown. There's a new Marxist government that makes peace with the Germans in exchange for being allowed some kind of legitimacy. And from this position, Germany suddenly only has to fight a one-front war. And so there's this idea on the part of the Germans that the Americans are going to come into the war anyway at some point. And so they should move quickly and try and finish the war. And so they return to unrestricted submarine killing zone or dead zone around the British Isles and sink 5 American ships. And this is just the end. So now, from this point onwards, the United States moves from just no diplomatic relations with the Germans to going to war against them.